The saloon hall in Cedar Bend had never seen a night quite like the one when Jonas Whitcombe rode in from Denver with 3 wagons of cattle money in his pocket and a reputation that preceded him by a full week, arriving in a town too small to hold its own excitement, so that by the time he actually stepped through the doors of the Colton Hotel dining hall for the harvest dance, every unmarried woman within 20 miles had already rehearsed, in the privacy of her own mirror, the particular tilt of her chin she intended to use when he finally noticed her. Jonas was not, by any honest measure, the handsomest man who had ever passed through Cedar Bend, but he was young, unattached, and worth more than the entire town's cattle herd combined, and in a place where most fortunes were measured in acres of dust, and the number of seasons a family had survived without losing a child to fever, a fortune like his carried a gravity that bent the behavior of nearly everyone around it. Clara Doyle understood this gravity better than most, because she had spent the last 3 years watching it operate from the vantage point reserved for those who serve rather than attend, carrying trays of roasted meat and bowls of buttered potatoes through crowds of women who would not have acknowledged her existence had she not been holding their supper. Clara had not always been a serving girl. Her father had owned a modest spread on the eastern edge of the valley until a bad winter and a worse drought the following summer had taken first his cattle and then, within the year, his life, leaving Clara at 17 with a mother too frail to work and a debt too large to pay through any honest means available to a woman alone. She had gone to work at the Colton Hotel not because she wanted to, but because the alternative was watching her mother starve, and she had learned, in the 3 years since, to fold herself into a kind of invisibility that made the work bearable, to move through rooms full of finely dressed townsfolk without meeting their eyes, to absorb the small cruelties of women who had once been her equals and were now, by the accident of her father's death, permitted to look through her as though she were a piece of the furniture. She did not resent the work itself. There was an honest dignity in it that she had come to respect, in the same quiet way she respected the calluses on her own hands. What she resented, on the nights she allowed herself to resent anything at all, was the particular flavor of humiliation reserved for a woman who had fallen from a station she once occupied, the way Emmeline Cross and her circle of friends seemed to take a special, curdled pleasure in reminding Clara, with small comments delivered in sweet voices, exactly how far she had descended. The harvest dance had been the social event of the season for as long as anyone in Cedar Bend could remember. And this year, with Jonas Whitcombe's arrival freshly announced, the entire town had thrown itself into preparation with an intensity that bordered on frenzy. Emmeline Cross had ordered a new gown from a seamstress in the territorial capital, deep maroon silk with gold embroidery that had cost, by the whispered estimates of the kitchen staff, more than Clara earned in half a year, and she had spent the week leading up to the dance holding court among the other unmarried women of good family, orchestrating with the precision of a general the seating arrangements and conversation topics that would position her most favorably in Jonas Whitcombe's eventual line of sight. Clara had no illusions about her own place in this arrangement. She would be working the dance, as she worked every gathering at the hotel, carrying trays and refilling glasses and making herself as unobtrusive as the wallpaper, and she told herself, in the days leading up to the event, that this suited her fine, that she had long since stopped imagining herself as anything other than what her circumstances had made her. The evening began exactly as everyone had expected it would. Jonas arrived fashionably late, dressed simply but well, and the chandeliers of the dining hall threw their warm light down over a room full of silk and lace and carefully arranged curls, and within minutes of his arrival, a small court of eager women had assembled themselves in his general orbit, laughing a fraction too loudly at anything he said, angling their shoulders to catch the best light. Clara moved through the edges of this spectacle with her serving tray, refilling punch glasses, delivering plates, watching the performance unfold with the detached interest of someone observing a play she had seen many times before, until the moment her path crossed directly with Jonas's own, the two of them arriving at the same narrow space between 2 tables at the same instant, and in her effort to avoid a collision that would have sent an entire tray of roasted meat and gravy across the floor, Clara stumbled against the edge of a chair someone had left pulled out too far, and though she managed to save the tray itself, a bowl of creamed corn slid from its edge and struck the polished wooden floor with a sound that seemed, in the sudden hush that followed, impossibly loud. The laughter that erupted was immediate and unkind, led by Emmeline Cross, whose voice carried across the room with a particular cruelty of someone who has been waiting all evening for exactly this kind of opportunity, remarking loudly to her companions that perhaps the hotel ought to hire staff who could manage the basic task of walking without incident. A comment that drew a ripple of laughter from the women around her and left Clara kneeling on the floor amid spilled corn and gravy, her cheeks burning with a humiliation so total it felt physical, a weight pressing down on her chest. She did not cry, because she had trained herself long ago not to cry in front of these people, but she felt the tears gathering anyway, hot and unwelcome, as she began gathering the broken bowl and its contents with hands that would not quite stop shaking, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes on her, of the particular silence that follows a public humiliation, that strange charged quiet in which everyone present understands they are watching something they will discuss for weeks afterward. It was into this silence that Jonas Whitcombe knelt down beside her on the floor of the dining hall, in front of the entire assembled company of Cedar Bend's finest families, and began, without any apparent self-consciousness at all, helping her gather the spilled food from the floorboards with his own bare hands, an act so far outside the expected behavior of a man in his position that the laughter died almost instantly, replaced by a confused murmur as the crowd tried to make sense of what they were witnessing. He said nothing dramatic in that moment, only a quiet word or two meant for her alone, something about the chair having been left carelessly in the walkway, a fact rather than a comfort, delivered in a tone that assumed her competence rather than pitying her clumsiness, and when the mess was gathered and Clara had regained enough composure to stand, Jonas stood with her, still holding the ruined bowl in one hand as though it were nothing at all, and he looked out at the assembled crowd, at Emmeline Cross in particular, whose maroon silk gown suddenly seemed less impressive than it had a moment before, and he asked, in a voice pitched to carry through the entire hushed room, whether any of them had ever worked a full day carrying trays for people who could not be bothered to remember their name. No one answered him, because there was no answer that would not have exposed the ugliness of what had just occurred, and into that silence, Jonas turned back to Clara, extended his hand, still faintly smeared with gravy, and asked her, simply and directly, if she would care to dance, a request so unexpected and so thoroughly outside the evening's carefully orchestrated script that for a moment Clara could only stare at him, certain she had misheard. She was, after all, still wearing her serving apron, her hair coming loose from its pins, her hands still trembling from the humiliation of moments before, and every instinct honed by 3 years of careful invisibility told her to decline, to retreat to the kitchen where she belonged, to avoid drawing any further attention to herself in a room full of people who had just demonstrated exactly how little regard they held for her. But something in Jonas's steady, unhurried gaze, some quality of genuine intention rather than performance, made her hesitate, and in that hesitation, she found herself reaching up to untie her apron instead, folding it over the back of a chair with hands that had finally stopped shaking, and taking his offered hand. The band, which had gone quiet along with everyone else, took a moment to find its footing again, but when the first notes of a waltz finally filled the hall, Jonas led Clara out onto the floor with the same unhurried confidence he had shown kneeling on the ground beside her, and if he noticed the stunned expressions of the crowd around them, the whispers already beginning to spread from table to table, he gave no sign of it, his attention fixed entirely on her, asking her as they moved together across the floor, about herself, her family, her father's ranch, questions no one in that room had thought to ask her in the 3 years since her father's death. And Clara found herself answering honestly, the old careful invisibility she had cultivated for so long beginning to crack open despite her best efforts to keep it intact. She told him about her father's cattle, about the drought that had taken everything, about her mother's frail health, and Jonas listened with an attentiveness that felt entirely unfamiliar to her, as though her words carried genuine weight rather than being merely the background noise of a servant's existence, and somewhere in the middle of that dance, surrounded by a room full of people who did not know how to process what they were witnessing, Clara allowed herself, for the first time in 3 years, to feel something other than the careful, guarded numbness she had built her life around. The dance ended, as dances do, but Jonas did not release her hand and retreat back into the crowd of eager admirers waiting to reclaim his attention. Instead, he asked her to sit with him, to share a plate of the very food she had been serving all evening, an invitation that scandalized the room nearly as much as the dance itself had, and though Clara felt the weight of dozens of disapproving stares throughout the meal, Jonas seemed entirely unbothered by them, engaging her in conversation about everything and nothing, about the mountains visible from her father's old property, about the horse he had ridden in on, about 100 small things that added up, over the course of the evening, to the first genuinely pleasant hours Clara had spent in the company of another person since before her father's death. Emmeline Cross and her circle watched this unfolding scene with expressions that shifted, over the course of the evening, from outrage to disbelief to a kind of grudging, furious recalculation, as it became increasingly clear that Jonas Whitcombe had no intention of returning to the game they had all assumed he was there to play. By the time the evening drew to its close, word had already begun spreading through Cedar Bend, carried by the same efficient gossip network that had, only hours before, been dedicated to cataloging Emmeline Cross's gown and speculating about Jonas's intentions, and by the following morning, the entire town understood that the wealthiest man to pass through their community in a generation had chosen, quite publicly and quite deliberately, to spend his evening in the company of the hotel's serving girl rather than any of the eligible daughters who had positioned themselves so carefully for his attention. Clara herself walked home that night in a state of quiet disbelief, uncertain what, if anything, the evening actually meant, aware that a single dance and a shared meal did not constitute any promise beyond themselves, and she told herself firmly, as she helped her mother into bed and banked the fire for the night, not to build any castles from what had likely been, for Jonas, nothing more than a moment's impulsive kindness towards someone the room had treated unfairly. But Jonas returned to the hotel the following afternoon, and the afternoon after that, each time finding some reason to seek out Clara specifically, bringing small gestures that accumulated meaning through their consistency rather than their grandness, a book he thought she might enjoy, an offer to have his own physician look in on her mother's health, a standing invitation to walk with him along the creek that ran behind the hotel property when her work allowed it, and over the weeks that followed, as autumn deepened toward winter, the town of Cedar Bend watched with a fascination that never entirely faded into ordinary acceptance, as the wealthiest bachelor to ever grace their community courted, openly and unhurriedly, the young woman who had once served their supper with her eyes carefully lowered. Emmeline Cross and her allies attempted, in the early weeks, various small campaigns to undermine the match. Comments delivered within earshot about Clara's diminished circumstances, pointed reminders of her father's failed ranch, but Jonas met each of these attempts with the same quiet, unruffled steadiness he had shown from the very first evening, and gradually, as it became clear that no amount of social maneuvering would alter his intentions, even his fiercest critics began to understand that this was not a passing fancy to be waited out. He asked her to marry him in the spring, not at some grand occasion designed for maximum audience, but quietly, beside the creek where they had spent so many of their afternoons together, and when she asked him, with the same directness that had characterized their entire courtship, why he had chosen her that first night, why a man who could have had his pick of any woman in the territory had instead knelt down on a dining hall floor beside a humiliated serving girl, he told her that he had grown up wealthy enough to recognize, better than most, the particular hollowness of people who valued him only for what he possessed, and that in the moment he had watched her kneel there among the spilled food, absorbing the crowd's cruelty with a dignity that asked nothing of anyone, he had seen something he had been searching for without fully realizing it. A person whose worth had nothing to do with silk gowns or careful social calculations, and everything to do with the quiet strength she carried through circumstances that would have broken many people entirely. Clara wept when he told her this, not from sorrow but from the particular relief of being seen, finally and completely, by someone who had looked past every layer of humiliation and hardship to find her still standing underneath, and when they married that summer, in a ceremony far simpler than anything Emmeline Cross would have chosen but infinitely more genuine, half of Cedar Bend attended, including, in the end, Emmeline herself, who had come, over the intervening months, to a grudging respect for the woman she had once mocked so publicly, and who found, sitting in the pews watching Clara walk down the aisle in a modest gown of her own choosing, that she could not entirely begrudge a happiness that had been built on something so much sturdier than the foundations her own careful campaigns had ever offered.